Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Mercy Week at St. Joseph's College of Maine. My name is Chris Fuller, and I'm the Chief Sponsorship and Mission Integration Officer here. Each week, from Monday through Thursday in the evenings, I will have a series of conversations with people on the focus questions for each week. And today, our focal question is, what is systemic racism? The guest for my conversation is Sherine Green. Sherine serves as the Director of Youth Faith Formation for Christ Our Light Catholic Community. She's also an instructor for the Villanova and St. Joseph's online programs. And for St. Joseph's, she teaches the Black Catholic Church as well as world religions. Prior to working for Christ Our Light, Sherine worked for the Romero Center in Camden, New Jersey, where she developed retreats for high school, colleges, and parishes groups from around the country. She was a Mercy volunteer in New York, so she has direct experience with Mercy, both in her education here at St. Joseph's, as well as with the Sisters of Mercy as a Mercy volunteer, and she completed her graduate studies here at St. Joseph's College of Maine. Sherine is from Jamaica, where she currently invites groups on mission immersion experiences. And during our conversation, if you'd like to ask a question of Sherine or of me to add to the conversation, if you take a look here at the screen, you will see the email address where you can send your conversation. And that is vpmission at sjcme.edu. So I'll give you a few moments here if you want to write it down. As I said, during our conversation, if you wish, please send an email to that account. I am monitoring the emails, and I will pose the questions to Sherine as they come in. So Sherine, thank you for joining me for this conversation tonight.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much, Dr. Fuller.
So our topic for tonight is systemic racism. So I want to start our conversation with kind of distinctions, if those are necessary. That is, in many ways, we tend to think of racism or as an act that someone does to another person, right? Either a person or a group. I might do something to you or to someone else that we would identify as racist, or I might be a member of a group. You know, most often we'd say a group like the KKK, right, or some kind of white supremacist group that undertakes certain kinds of actions. Is that kind of racism the same thing as systemic racism?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Fuller. Those are questions that people sometimes wonder about. And in the American context, if you've lived here long enough, I've lived here for 10 years, you're able to see specifically the issues of systemic racism. It's not literally, a person being racist to another person. It's a system set up that sometimes we may not be able to see clearly because of our bias or because our eyes are simply closed. There are good people who oftentimes ignore systemic racism because they just simply don't know. So it's a system set up to prevent a certain movement from happening, a certain flow, which robs one group of people of their dignity and it really sets up another group of people to thrive. So it's systematic in its approach. It can be, long and short of the answer is you can be blinded by it. You can be, blinded by how it robs a person of their dignity and that single story understanding of what it truly is. Today, I actually talked to a friend of mine. He's a priest in the Anglican Church. His name is Reverend Dr. Mike Jean Siracusa. And his response is that, people are not necessarily racist. They're just simply not aware of how the system is structured and how it's set up to prevent growth from happening for some people.
So can you give us an example of the ways in which many of us don't recognize those systems, what we're not seeing, right?
Sure, absolutely. So it's really difficult to see. If you've been brought up in a place where everything looks beautiful, if you've been brought up where life is happening and everything is thriving for you, it's difficult to understand why a certain group of people exist or live a certain way sociologically or economically. So we see Philadelphia, for instance, which is not too far from where I am right now streaming with you. We see some people, the neighborhoods oftentimes in one part of Philadelphia is run down, and in another part it's really nicely developed. And so people may not understand, people may say, why can't those people get it together? Why are those people the way they are? Why can't they just simply do better with themselves. I mean, we do better. Our ancestors worked hard. They came here as Irish American immigrants or Italian immigrants, and they did, they had a hard time, but they did well. What is wrong with those people over there? That is for me, an example of how we sometimes rob people of their dignity because of our inability to see, our inability to understand, our inability to learn or question without questioning deeper even and trying to understand. So housing becomes an issue. Why are those houses, certain houses, the way they are? Neighborhoods. And so while I was preparing for this, I asked somebody to help me to understand from a Caucasian experience, from a white lens, in what way. And one of my friends mentioned redlining. Now, some people may not understand what that term means. Redlining, happened, and you may wonder, like, why is it a certain neighborhood look a certain way, and another neighborhood is progressive and well developed in a suburban community, for instance. Well, communities like Camden, which is where I'm streaming from right now, we had issues like white flight that happened. So significant groups of white people left the city of Camden. Well, I only know 3 white people that remained since the 50s, and they're here and they stayed. They never left. And I can, shout out to my neighbor Wayne Radzaminski, for instance, who, have stayed as an educator in the city and never left. So white flight happened, and what that presented was a community that was left with mostly struggling Black people, which resulted in a situation of poverty, of economics, robbing people of their dignity, and simply a single story, which Chimamanda Adichie talks about, robbing people of their dignity, taking away from the true value of people. So definitely, I think housing is an example. Education is another example. We see where certain school districts are more affluent, so they have more resources. They're able to do better. While some neighborhoods, we could compare Camden and Cherry Hill, which are the 2 areas that I work in, generally speaking, and we can see where the children from Cherry Hill do significantly better than the children in the Camden district. Is it that the kids here in Camden are not as smart? Some people may wonder. That's a good question to ask. Like, what is the difference and what causes that disparity? So housing, education, healthcare. Recently, Johnson & Johnson's shared some recent studies of, women of color who go to see their OBGYNs for oftentimes get treated differently. That's one example. But we see that in the healthcare system, we see that in education, housing, and the list goes on. The prison system, if you've read Brian Stevenson, I don't know if you've read any of his books, but Brian Stevenson, I was just on his TED Talk the other day. He talks about just being proximate, listening and seeing why is it, or asking. Let's go back to asking the question. Why are some people why are so many African Americans, for instance, in our prison system? What causes that? What's the reason for that? And that will take you back to systemic racism and the injury of systemic racism.
I think you provide a helpful way for us to kind of approach this, which is we could either approach it by saying, why are those people like, or we could say, what happened that this is as it is, right? There's a different way. It's like you said, the single story, right? If we approach something only as a single story, then our own upbringing, our perspective is going to inform that story, and we're going to address the situation in a variety of different ways. For many of us, from my own background, my own white background, right, our predominant question might be often, why are they like that? Rather than what happened or what are the conditions that resulted in things as they are. So you mentioned, for example, redlining, right? That is, we're all aware of the GI Bill after the Second World War, which provided both access to education and housing for GIs, except African Americans. So they did not have the opportunity to go to college for almost free after they came home from the war. They did not have the opportunity to get loans to buy homes, which then could accrue equity and pass on that wealth, or sell those homes and accrue wealth over time. And that has a generational impact over time, correct?
Correct. And we see that. I'm in the city of Camden, and it's pretty visible. You would wonder what exactly the question, which I liked how you framed that question in a very mercy charism way. Could you say that question again? Just
the question, I guess, we can look at these circumstances different ways. One might be, why are they that way?
Right.
Aren't they different?
Right.
And that question is really from the perspective, say, my upbringing, which is, well, my upbringing is I had the opportunities. I got my high school degree. I went on to college. I worked hard for what I got. What is
Right.
it, why aren't they working hard to get the same thing? Or I
Right.
could ask the question, what is it that has transpired, right,
Correct.
that has resulted in the differences that I see before me? So rather than approaching it as a matter of judgment based on my own framework or my own upbringing, asking the question of why is there the difference? What has happened that has resulted in the difference? And from
Mhm.
that, we then begin to look at history. We begin to look at policies rather than making assumptions.
And that's exactly it. Policy making. So what are the policies that are out there? I think education is probably our biggest part of this too. Like, not only asking the question, but educating ourselves.
Mhm. Tell me if you think this is a help. This is something I've thought of. So I am. My wife is Mexican. I
Oh,
married into a Mexican family, very traditional Mexican family. They're all Spanish speakers. My mother-in-law only speaks Spanish, and I've had these conversations with my wife because my upbringing was very much the kind of suburban '70s white kid upbringing.
right.
And when I read now some of the literature, books like White Rage,
Hmm.
How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Hmm.
My guest on Wednesday night will be Debbie Irving, who wrote Waking Up White.
Hmm.
There's much of their experience that resonates with my own when I met my wife, which is the things that she was experiencing, as we talked earlier, that I wasn't seeing, right?
Right.
The things I thought were just one off experiences that I dismissed, that for her were actually the 100th time it's happened, right? Or the
Yeah.
whatever time
Right.
it's happened.
Right.
And in trying to enter into that experience from my very limited perspective, or my perspective, the other day I had this analogy that I thought of. And I always say acknowledge analogies can only take us so far. There's a point at which the analogy doesn't work and it breaks down.
Right.
I'm left-handed, and in the '70s, if you were left-handed, you were very well aware that the world around you was ring.
Right.
Scissors were right-handed, guitars were for right-handed people. You had to learn it. Things were made in that way.
Hmm.
Desks were for right-handed people.
Sure. Yeah.
You couldn't sit at a desk that was made for left-handed people. And so I had to learn to adapt. Now the difference is, where the breakdown is, I could adapt without anyone noticing. Right?
Hmm.
Whereas the difference for you, for my wife, and for others is you can't change your skin color. Um,
Cannot. No.
so is that at all a helpful analogy in terms of my trying to think through what the experience must be like for you or for my wife or for others who are constantly navigating a world
Yeah.
arranged in a different way that I've just taken for granted as the
Yeah.
way things are, the normal way that things are, right?
Sure. That's a brilliant analogy. I've never even thought of that. But if you think of that, like I can't imagine what that must have been like for you. I cannot imagine because I grew up in a world now where, there's right and left-handedness and all of that. But I'm putting myself from a white person's lens.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sympathetic to what happened to you, but it's a very helpful analogy because as you're saying that, I'm having a heartfelt moment where I'm saying, wow, it must have been difficult. And a million questions are rising in my mind. Like, how did you manage? What were some of the roadblocks? How were you able to overcome as you're saying that? So I'm just thinking from another lens. It's a very good example for someone to consider in relating both experiences.
Yeah, and I would say it was a challenge, but not a difficulty in the same way that, say, my wife or
Hmm.
others have faced difficulties, right? I
Hmm.
never, I never faced someone deliberately erecting barriers to
Hmm.
my moving forward, right? Those things existed because they were made in a world that simply was organized for right-handed people.
Hmm.
No one was actively erecting impediments to my progress, right?
Right.
That's another difference, right?
Right.
That's again where
Exactly.
the analogy breaks down. Is I have to recognize where the limit is, right? That experientially, I've had an experience of what it's like for the world to be organized in a way different than my experience,
Mm-hmm.
but no one ever systematically or deliberately erected barriers to prevent my progress.
Right.
It's been different for the African American community, for the Native
Right.
community, for other
Right.
communities in this country, correct?
Correct. And you weren't constantly being put down for it. You weren't
Yes.
constantly being placed in a corner. And then I think what's most upsetting is you weren't told, that you're just making this up. You're not left-handed. You can make something of yourself, right? So even though you have this issue or whatever, first of all, the problem doesn't exist because you don't have a problem. You're just making stories up. Number one, I think that would have really done something to you spiritually. That would have really taken a toll on the heart. And so, as you're saying that, I'm just thinking of how many people every single day are told, no, this doesn't exist. Or, stop talking about this. You go to church and people are saying, stop praying about this stuff. Stop talking about racism in church. We don't want to hear this nonsense. Stop talking about it in our sporting arenas. Stop talking about it. Period. Just be silent about it.
So when you hear that, when you hear people say that either, well, this is your problem, or I wish people would just stop talking about it, what do you hear?
A
Right?
part of me, a part of me oftentimes feels defeated. I earlier in the summer I had a conversation with a lady who was very upset by the whole Black Lives Movement subject and a post that I'd put up on my church page. And she was upset because the church is talking about this. And I tried to understand her. I tried to listen to her story, but there's a part in me that for months this is a true confession, but I felt defeated in a lot of ways. I felt almost like silenced, and that's what happens. I'm not African American, so I'm not from the culture that's been the dominant culture that's being ridiculed. However, I'm Black. That's what I pass as. I have an Indian mother and a Black and Chinese father, and so and I'm Jamaican by birth. I am a U.S. citizen. Let's just point that out. A very proud one. But it's interesting to me that I've only been here for about a decade or so, but I felt silenced. I felt defeated. I felt mocked. I felt like a part of me was broken, and I still do in a lot of ways. I cried, I prayed. I'm like, please, Lord, I felt afraid, almost like she was going to write to the bishop or something, and have my position removed because she's saying that I utilize my power. And our priest was beautiful in just simply saying, well, Jesus confronted the systemic issues of his time, and Sherine didn't do anything wrong. So I just can't imagine people who would never get that ability to speak. People who are robbed of their dignity every single day of being able to speak to this issue. And God knows there's a lot of hatred right now. And my prayer is, how do we resolve this? I guess that's why I was happy to hear of St. Joe's doing this. Because how do we prayerfully stand with, in solidarity with, and be proximate to, and willingly listen and not silence people for their pain.
Mhm. Yeah, it's you mentioned your addressing this on with regard to your church.
Mm-hmm.
Some people's responses to that. I think it's important to note that, at least within the Catholic Church, the U.S. bishops have published a number of documents specifically on
Absolutely.
the topic of racism.
Mm-hmm.
At least one of which I know um, uses the kind of language that we're using right now,
Correct.
that
Correct.
talks about
Yeah.
not just
Brothers and Sisters is a perfect example. I've read that.
exactly,
Familiar with
and it
it.
speaks not just to racist actions that people do, but to systemic racism, right? To
Correct.
the and systemic racism isn't just something that happens out there; it's
Mm-hmm.
something that happens within the church, among individuals within the church, right? And the church is summoning us to be honest about
Right. Right. And it was Pope Francis that helped us to recognize a little bit more about that a church is really a place where it's like a hospital, right? He uses that word because that's where, us, meaning you and me, brothers and sisters, are. We're challenged, we're sick, we're ill. We have all kinds of injuries that needs to be repaired, that needs to be healed. So the church is that place of healing, and so that's how I kind of look at it. Racism is a matter of healing souls and healing hearts. And so how do we, bring people to the table and be more inclusive versus pointing people out? And, nobody wants to be called a racist. I was just reading an article from NPR, and, it's nobody wants to use that word ever. So, more ways to include people and to to use a church's language, even of letting people know that this is what the church teaches, this is what the church believes. All are welcome.
Mhm. So we have a question. A question came in from email.
Okay.
And someone asked, would you elaborate on how are women of color treated differently by OBGYN physicians?
Oh, they're listening. Very good. Okay, so I could say I have two boys, right? So I have Philip and Paul. Perfect names, right? For theology teacher here. I have Philip and Paul, and I was like that nervous patient, right? So I was anxious and scared, and for a long time I was like, I can never have children. I'm scared. But my husband and I, we have these two boys, and we were treated very well. Let me just say, we were treated very well, excellent, and all that. Couple of reasons. One, I have medical insurance. Two, I think I'm educated, but even people that are educated will sometimes tell you that they've been treated differently or they're robbed of their dignity by certain nurses or doctors in their hospital experience. And three, the privilege was I knew a lot of the doctors and nurses. So, I had like a step up in my mind. I had an advantage. I had a privilege. But many women go without insurance. Many women go into the hospitals not knowing, not being treated before, not seeing the doctor every week or every 2 weeks before going in for labor. And so, they're automatically at a disadvantage. Their nutrition is at a disadvantage. They're, treated differently. Doctors become frustrated with them when they're not following the rules, when they didn't take their prenatal vitamins, or their child is at a huge disadvantage because their nutrition level is off, or the mother is just simply unaware of what she needs to do. So we see where we all have biases, and a friend of mine reminded me of this today. We all have certain things that block our vision or our view, our lens perhaps. And so, what are my biases? I know what they are, some of them. I don't know what all my biases are. I realize that I respond to some people differently. I respond to some people differently. Maybe, maybe out of movies, like I like a certain, I may respond to a certain person because they look a certain way from a movie, or from my experience, or from my culture. It's the same when you go into hospitals. I teach at Villanova now as well, and I say to my nursing students, when you go into hospitals, look for people that are likely to be not speaking the language, that the English language, for instance. Look for people who may not have insurance. Well, they may not know that information straight up, but look for people that may seem marginalized or weak or worried or scared. Find those people, which is really Jesus's message. Today's the feast of Saint Matthew, and I'm just thinking of that. Like, just find people that are downtrodden, people that oftentimes African Americans are just simply dropped off at the hospital. They don't know what to do and all that. So that's just one example of how they may be treated differently because of biases that the staff may have, or they may not be able to do what they were supposed to do nutrition wise and exercise. But while you're pregnant, I remember them saying, walk every day 30 minutes. Well, depending on the person's circumstance, they may not be able to do it based on their job, or based on their ability to comprehend, or based on what they know. Because if they didn't see a doctor all along, they may be eating fast food through the whole pregnancy, or they may just simply not know. And that's just one example of someone not knowing in terms of OBGYN. I have a housing example that just happened to me 2 days ago, or today even, of a man that was homeless. And we noticed him. He lives in our neighborhood. He was evicted. Now, he did not know where to go, who to talk to, what numbers to call. He doesn't have a telephone. He's bedridden, and he's sleeping on the porch somewhere in the neighborhood. People have called housing development. People have called social work departments. Nobody responded. So I reached out to a friend of mine who's a social worker at a place called Joseph's House. It's a Catholic-run organization. Joseph's House connected me with the Volunteers of America. Immediately, within 2 hours, Volunteers of America picked up this man today. I did not know this. And then when I called, I found out that this man, his name is Tim, with the brightest smile and biggest hellos, who was homeless and homebound and just sitting on a step. He was picked up by the VOA. He'll be given housing. He'll be given health care. He'll be taken care of. But that's simply because we know. That's where the privilege is, when when you have access to information, when you're able to connect the dots for people. If you're African American and you're poor and you don't have the resources and you don't have the connections, or you just simply don't know, then you're not taken seriously. You're not taken seriously by doctors. You're not taken seriously by social workers. You're simply pushed in a corner. You're simply like looked down on. Like, why can't you get it together? You have a certain name, and people start to ostracize you and marginalize you. That's my reason for naming my sons Philip and Paul. They have a last name Radbury. My husband is Radbury's Indian. And I thought for a long time, I'm like, do I change my last name? Do I change any of that? No, I'm still Green for that reason. So, there is a system, and it's there, and you probably can't see it because you've never experienced it. I've never experienced your left-handedness or what happened in the 70s, but I can try to like question and wonder and ask more and dig deeper to try to make sense of it.
And and you've noted there, and again, another kind of systemic issue that arises in these circumstances, right? And that is
Mm-hmm.
very often in these communities where someone has an experience like you just described, say homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Many communities, especially urban communities, and even smaller communities, like when I used to live in Montana, the transportation infrastructure is set up in a way that it's very difficult actually for people to not only not know where those resources might be, but to access those resources as well if they don't have their own transportation.
Mm-hmm.
So to even know where one might go, getting there may also be an issue because of the
Mm-hmm.
way that the transportation infrastructure has been set up. Correct?
Exactly. So it's all the setting up. I think that's a foundation of understanding what systemic racism is. The setup, the structure, the way it's mobilized, and the way it filters into our system and into our lives without us even knowing.
Mhm. And well, I'm going to stay on the topic of healthcare here for just a moment because I think
Hmm.
also where we're seeing right now, right
Correct.
before our eyes, an example of systemic racism, right, is to take a look at who the coronavirus is impacting and where,
Correct.
what community.
Correct. Correct.
See a disproportionate impact among communities of color, especially African American, Native American, and Latino communities, correct?
So it breaks my heart reading that. I feel like since COVID started, my head has been spinning. And, today I'm also not feeling very well. Thus, I've been recommended to drink lots of water. But I just feel like the information out there is so overwhelming and so toxic that, it can be easy for people to just shut their TVs off and say, no, this is too much, or people are making this up, or these numbers are wrong, or, these statistics are wrong. But the truth is, when you get close to people and you begin to know their stories, the people who prepare our food, today we stopped at Burger King for my little guy. We don't always do this, but, we wanted to get him a shake, for instance. Every single person back there in the Burger King, African American people. All people that have had the people we call essential workers, the people that are packing our groceries in this area, at least. I don't know about Maine too much, but in this area, it's really predominantly African American and Latinos that are doing the work, that are continuing the industry, that's making sure the food is trucked to us, that's making sure we have our food. And they're the first ones to get hit. They're the first ones to get sick, and then their children get sick. Today, I read this overwhelming number that a 2-month-old baby, first of all, just died of COVID. And it's our parents. The parents are working in different places that they're easy to contract the virus, and they don't have the luxury of staying home. A lot of my programs have been able to shift automatically online and to work online. People who are essential workers don't have that ability. They have to be there if it's housing. I mean, if they're in healthcare, if they're in outside of doctors and nurses, and the guys that are executives in the hospital and all that, and ladies. Sorry to be sexist there, but gender is important to address as well. But it's really heartbreaking because the people that are taking care of us, the people that are making sure that Amazon gets to our door, are the people most vulnerable right now.
Yes, and California, where I'm originally from, upwards of I think 55% of the cases were Latinos, and it's the same there. It's the same issue. They're the ones who are working the fields. They're in
Sure,
service industries, right? And
sure.
so they're the ones that are at the front lines again, of perhaps
Mhm.
exposed to this virus and therefore more
Mhm.
vulnerable, and because of wages, less likely perhaps to have health care or adequate health care, right? They tend.
Right. And that's a heartbreaking part, like these are the people that are making sure that we're well fed, that we get our medicines. They're in warehouses. They're, making sure that we get our food and all that. Like they should be well taken care of. And if I had one wish, I would make sure that executives could understand this perspective, to make sure, because a lot of them could do much better. And most of them, all of them could do much better, and just simply being mindful and learning what this means, learning how this affect people, and understanding that together we're all connected. So if one member of the chain falls, like the chain is going to be bent, it's going to be broken ultimately. So that's a connection that people don't seem to get.
Thank you. I think that's an important point too, is the interconnectedness,
Hmm.
right, of ourselves, an interconnected web of the resources to which we have access,
Hmm.
who works at and makes sure we have access to those resources,
Hmm.
who does or does not have access to those resources. It's far more interconnected, I think, than we often realize.
Absolutely. And if that could be understood, I think that would set us up on another rung on the ladder.
We have another question that came in.
Oh, good.
Someone said, "Can you speak on your thoughts about systemic racism in the police or among the police?"
That's one that I was hoping to dodge a little bit out of fear, but I'll take it because we're in a mercy institution. So it's beautiful. It's good that someone's asking that question. I appreciate it. At Villanova, one of the books that I have our students reading is Just Mercy. Also, our parish is using Just Mercy as a parish one book. And so, when you think of a prison system and how that's set up and the marginalization that happens there, I think a lot of the way our police members are trained is there's not really implicit bias tests that happen. And also, I can speak for Camden, where I am, is, police interact. The police members, from the chief to the guy that's riding the bike, they all interact with community members. We know our police chief, we know who they are, and we talk to them. We have, hot dog nights at the stand. And so, kids grow up trusting their police. They grow up knowing that the police isn't really there as bad. The police is there to help. It's a different perspective when you see on TV, one black man was shot by the police, and you wonder, like, wait a minute, but that's not the experience I've had. So you wonder, like, where is that disconnect and how is that happening in different parts of America where we're seeing it popping up in different places, some places you haven't even heard of. And so what is the disconnect and why is that happening? So there's an awful lot of that there. There is that blindness, that bias, that understanding that if you have a certain name or if you fit a certain look, surveillance, like you'll be, in certain parts of the Jersey Turnpike, you'll be surveyed and pulled over almost, which we've seen happening in the last few weeks even more. So there is that, and we try not to think about it. I'm saying we, in terms of the Black community. I have a brother that's about 6'5", and he's got dreads. I don't know why. I've begged him, please take those dreads away from your hair, because in my mind, like, I'm automatically judging my brother based on society and stereotypes. Like, I want him to kind of look like you, Chris. I want him to, like, be tucked in a little bit and be tucked up, because that's what society says that you should look like if you're successful, and to prevent you from not being pulled over by the police or all that. He also Mercedes Benz. I don't know why, but thanks. He's an immigrant trying to, like, fit the status of what success looks like. He's trying to meet that a little bit. So, he's young. He's a young kid. But my fear oftentimes is, what could possibly happen as he drives and all of that. And, some people say, just follow the rules. Well, he follows the rules. He just doesn't listen to me and cut his hair. Some people will say, well, why don't you do what the police says when you get pulled over or when you get stopped? A lot of people do. We've seen that. A lot of people have cooperated. We've seen that. And still, by the size or height of people, they may be threatened automatically by the person that pulls them over. So there's a lot of bias, and I think our police need to be taught better. They need maybe some people of color, perhaps some women of color, to go in there and even teach some of the stuff that we're talking about right now to help open the minds and the eyes and the lens of our police officers.
I'm gonna, just for our viewers, I'm gonna pull up again here our title slide here, so people can again see it.
Okay.
Brief moment here. So
I'm gonna
if
take
you're
my water while you do that.
watching us for our conversation here, I'm Chris Fuller at St. Joseph's College of Maine, the Chief Sponsorship and Mission Integration Officer. And this is part of our week-long series of evening conversations on anti-racism, as part of our Mercy Week programming. And if you take a look at your screen here, you'll see the email where you can send in your questions, which is bpmission@sjcme.edu. So I want to go back to something you said here about your brother, because I think it speaks again to the experience, right? In terms of
Right.
trying to understand this topic of anti-racism. And that is, you talked about your conversation with your brother about how not to get pulled over.
Mm-hmm.
I've never had that conversation with anybody, right? I think that speaks to what we're talking about, right? Is that I think oftentimes many people don't know that the types of conversations that take place in communities of color are these types of conversations.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
I grew up with the assumption that if the police officer flashes his lights, I pull over and I'm going to be treated probably fairly.
Okay.
Something wrong, he's going to ask for my license. It's going to be a fairly um, it's going to be a fairly uneventful exchange. Right? I'll be nervous because I got pulled over.
Right.
I'll be nervous that something's going to go wrong, right? Whereas what you're describing is a conversation that many in the Latino, African American, and other communities have, which are these conversations around what to do when you get pulled over. Correct?
Right. Right. I think I'm thinking of a couple things. I'm thinking of the fight flight hormone too that sometimes hits. And as a woman, I sometimes don't oftentimes feel that as much when I drive past the police in the suburbs. I sometimes don't feel that. But if my husband is driving, I may say, well, make sure you're watching the speed limits. I may be a little bit more nervous, and so even listening to mothers, African American mothers or Latino mothers talk about what they tell their children. I'm getting to think, my sons are 4 and 1, so I'm not really there yet with them driving. Hopefully they're not driving right now, but they're playing their video games or something. But I wonder what my conversation will be in once they turn 17 or 18 and they start driving. Perhaps it'll be different then, and that's my hope and my dream, that will be more inclusive society, that will shed ourselves of the fear and hatred that we see happening right now, in terms of people. But but going back to the fight or flight hormone that I was talking about, it's people do two things when they see the police. They get very scared and fidgety, and they do exactly what they're told, or they may make a couple hiccups, couple sudden movements, and that may throw a police officer off. Or flight. Some people may decide they're not going to stop. They're going to keep driving, or they're going to keep running. And we've seen where people have been injured as a result of that. But I'm thinking, I mentioned woman, and I my heart breaks right now for this, but it's Sandra Bland. This happened, what, 3-4 years ago. This woman, Sandra Bland, was driving, and she fought back, and we see where that cost her life. We're never sure as to how she actually died, because she was taken into custody and all of that, but we know that she had died. She was pronounced dead in custody. So you think of a situation like that, or circumstance where she was a little mouthy according to people, and I could see myself being the opposite, just because I'm educated in terms of follow the rules kind of thing. But I know of circumstances as well where people follow the rules and do everything they're supposed to do, but they're still treated in that marginalized way. So what do you do? How do you fix that? When a certain group of people are demonized by the way they look, sound, their accents, their way, their mannerisms, their style, their flair, as you would say in the city. How do you respond to that? I don't know.
In fact, for many in the white community, seeing the video of George Floyd dying was really a wake up call to them. That I think you said it in our conversation, right? Very oftentimes, people are dismissed. People in the African American community are dismissed for saying, for telling the stories they've been telling about the experiences they've had. Very often the response being, well, if you just cooperated, if you just followed the rules. And since the death of George Floyd, since the murder of George Floyd, actually we've seen a number of videos now that have also been distributed. Example, a few weeks ago, an African American woman on her own porch, who was someone called the police because she was being too loud
Oh, wow.
during the daytime.
Well,
The police officer approached her. She's telling the police officer, "This is my property." The police officer knocks her to the ground and tries to put her in handcuffs. And it's not clear, it wouldn't be clear from my perspective, why is this happening?
Mm.
But um, it speaks to both the experience I have heard from my African American friends who've told me
Yeah.
about this. And I think it also speaks to what you said earlier, which is oftentimes the African American community, other community scholars have been dismissed as if these are one off
Right.
circumstances, when in fact these happen far more than we, from my perspective, white perspective, know about or are willing to admit, correct?
Right, right. You're absolutely correct. I've two stories, two quick examples of where it's so embedded in my mind, and people may say, "Oh, black people, you're making stories up," or it's all in your head, or it's not real, or that kind of thing. People will dismiss you. Once again, I think of back of the summer where I was silenced, and I'm very careful how I speak about this subject now as a result of that experience of when the George Floyd situation started, and my response, a prayerful stance, and how it might have offended somebody else, how it might have offended someone who have a different perspective. So a friend of mine at school, the school that I work in, offered me some lilies, and she said, "Go on my porch." She lives in the suburbs. Cherry Hill is a nearby suburb around here. And she says, "Go on my porch and pick up the lilies that I left for you on the porch." The first thought that crossed my mind is, one, what are the neighbors gonna think? Is somebody gonna consider, why is somebody going on to Mrs. Clary's porch to pick up a box or a container? Could the police be called out for me doing that? So I walked, my husband drove up to the gate, and I walked in there. They weren't there. It was a daytime, and I was told, "Go pick up these lilies or lilacs or whatever they were that I was picking up." And I went. There were bulbs, plant bulbs, and I picked them up. But in my mind, I was like, okay, what if? So what if crossed my mind, right? And I'm just thinking if that would cross the mind of a white person, or how do people perceive that, and how would a white person perceive that? And then secondly, we have some friends in Cape Cod, Standish, or not Standish, Sandwich. Sandwich sounds very close to Standish, doesn't it? It's like I'm making a mistake there with the two places, but Sandwich is where they live, and they said, "Oh, you can use our home." So 2 years ago, we went up to Cape Cod, and we've never been there before, and we were absolutely delighted. And we're in this town called Sandwich. And we get out, of course, we flew up, we didn't drive because we had our little baby, and it's late at night. And the first thought that crossed my mind is, what if the neighbors see some people of color going into this home? It's really late, it's 10 o'clock, knowing that the owners that live there aren't there. Obviously, you would be, in any neighborhood, you'd probably wonder, like, what's going on? Who are these people? But that crossed my mind, and that was a little scary because my friends weren't going to be there. They were traveling, they were gone. And I did not want that to be a situation where, once again, the police was called. It wasn't our property, as you're mentioning. So those are just two examples of stories where I have been left with some kind of footprint of the damage that's out there, and how it kind of robbed people of their dignity. Like, you want to say to people, "No, I'm not that person that you're thinking of, that you've probably seen in a movie," because once again, when you watch movies, sometimes the roles that African Americans play are the gangster and the thug that's a certain way, and you start thinking that all African Americans must sound a certain way, or look a certain way, or be a certain way, when that's not the reality at all.
And I think that to two things there. One is, yes, and the ways in which we are subconsciously shaped by those representations and images. When I was in graduate school, which was in Berkeley, California, I was walking home one night. I was reading a book for a class, as graduate students are prone to do, right? We read as we walk and trying to read as much as we can. And I noticed someone out of my peripheral vision coming towards me, and I moved to get out of that person's way. And I thought that's what I was doing. And that person confronted me and said, "Did you just get out of the way because I'm black?"
Oh.
And I thought, what if I did? I don't
Yeah.
think that I did, but was I conditioned in a way, almost reflexively, like you said, to move because of the saturation of
Mm.
media portrayals, right? Especially
Mhm.
right
Mhm.
in the 70s, which there were many more of these kinds of portrayals
Mhm.
than there are now, when there's an attempt, at least in some ways, to try to portray African Americans and others in at least some better light than there was at
Right.
the time. So That's the first thing, is the ways in which I myself had been conditioned, perhaps in ways that I wasn't yet recognizing. The second thing is, I think you give an example that speaks again to the difference of our experience, right? If someone called me and said, "There's daisies on my porch, come get them," I'd go get them, and I probably wouldn't have the second thought.
You probably
What I'm
wouldn't.
hearing you say is you're already formulating scenarios,
Right.
how to respond, anticipating that someone might see you walking up the porch and might have certain assumptions about what they're seeing, and you've got to be prepared for how to respond in case something
Sure.
happens.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's amazing, right? So I have a 4-year-old, and it's pretty interesting to see how 4-year-olds think. He already knows that there's something going on in the system and the world based on the cartoons, based on, just even games or storybooks. So the way storybooks are set up is that the hero is always someone that's white, someone that's Caucasian. So, thanks to Black Panther, which he's not gonna see right now. He's too young. But there are tons of books where people are more intentional now of integrating books where people of color are also the heroes, where your white child can see that a Latino child can also be the hero in a story, and that sets up the mind differently. Because pre-COVID, I was hearing he went to preschool for the first time, and I heard him say, Mama, I want to be white. I questioned that a little bit. I wondered, could it be my surrounding? Could I have set him up for that? Because my surrounding is pretty, the way I work theologically, it's always a very white community that I have the privilege of working with in all my work. But we live primarily in an African American community with Latinos and, few whites. As I said, the 3 white people I know that stayed after white flight happened, they're my friends. And so, could I have been the one that have set him up? So now this summer, I intentionally made sure that he was reading stories that were, showing people of color as also the hero, that he was hearing stories of West Africa, that he was learning stories of the African context, beyond the African American context, beyond America, but in the world and the global spectrum, the global world in at large. So that's kind of where I'm at in educating. My education never ends. It seems like I'm constantly like teaching kids, middle school, high school, preschool, college, on how to understand, how to interpret, how to question, and how to see people like from different, remove some of the biases, and to see all people as God's people, to see our connections, to see that we all belong to the same mystery, the same divine, the same God.
Now, you mentioned that you have lived in the United States for 10 years. You are
Mm-hmm.
from Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
Have you noticed on this question of systemic racism, or this topic of systemic racism, have you noticed a difference between your experience in America versus your experience in Jamaica?
So, very good question. I'm actually working on a book right now, which is going to be published by Paulist. Paulist Publishers said yes to it, so that's a good thing. And my partner and my colleague is Vince Gallagher. So he's a white guy from Philadelphia that tells his story. He's in his 70s, and here I am as a Jamaican sharing my story as an immigrant coming to the United States. I may be here a little bit longer than 10 years, but 10 years just sound good. I don't have to calculate much. It's good to go. A decade. I've been here for a decade. The difference. So I grew up seeing America on TV, seeing Black people treated a certain way, seeing, the roles that we just talked about, the projects in New York, for instance, and not really seeing, if unless you dug deeper, to see people like Oprah or not Dennis Rodman, what's the other guy, Michael Jordan. Unless you really dug deep, you would see African Americans that are really outstanding. Unless you were a good reader, a wide reader, you'd hear about Condoleezza Rice, or you'd hear about Colin Powell, who has Jamaican ancestry, by the way. And so growing up in Jamaica, it's a different lens. You see America in a certain way, you understand it to be a certain way, but you kind of know that it's a place of opportunity. That no matter what your skin type is, you're going to come here and you're going to push and you're going to work really hard. But the truth is, we see where, as a result of colonization, in our own Jamaican context, we've seen racism as well. So we've seen where, the lighter you are, you in back in the day, and even now, some ways, a shape and form. If you're lighter, you may get a certain job, or if you have a certain last name, you get a certain high position, executive position. And so I grew up seeing that. I grew up understanding classism. I grew up seeing racism. I understood that if I was well educated, that I would kind of be, in a privileged position. And thanks be to God, that's been my success, along with the Sisters of Mercy, because I came here as a Mercy volunteer. So that's been my privilege, as being surrounded by mercy, by being surrounded by that charism, which is probably why I'm so passionate about it. Being surrounded by that gift, knowing that there's this part of the church, there is, and it is church teaching that speaks volumes to mercy, and that charism of welcome and inclusivity. And getting my education as well has been a gift. So an American standard education that, I came here with my undergraduate degrees too. And, coming here and doing postgraduate studies as well has given me a certain privilege as a woman of color, to speak in forums such as this. Like, I thank you for this opportunity. And I thank our president as well at St. Joe's for this opportunity. But, I just wonder, like, if I didn't have the setup that I did, I would be one of those people on the street that nobody would look at, that nobody would even talk to, that, I'd be part of that statistic that's ill-treated and marginalized. So I'm oftentimes reflecting on that. So from a Jamaican lens, to answer your question, yes, you see that, you experience that, but you kind of like push through and find ways around it.
So you mentioned classism, and someone actually sent in a question about that, and they asked, the question is, do you see a relationship between systemic racism and classism?
Yes. So, well, we know the difference, right? We understand what systemic racism is. It's a system that's fueled and set up, and people fail as a result of that. But there is classism, which allows some people to rise. So you'll see, like, even African Americans that have risen up. Sometimes people don't want to look back to where they came from. They don't want to see, the poor communities that they're from. So they sort of disassociate, and so there's that classism of being in another context, of doing well, of thriving, and just kind of not wanting to connect to that or speak against or speak to this issue. So, I could answer that in many ways. I could see where people want to disassociate, in terms of systemic racism and in terms of racism. And, there are certainly a lot of privileged African Americans that will not speak to this. One, they're silenced, because if you look, if you have a certain power or privilege and you speak to this subject, you could easily be looked on as a political issue, which it's not. It's a matter of human connection. It's a matter of just being human, of me respecting and loving you, and you seeing that, as the Hindus say, the namaste, the divine within me. And if we can't do that, then there's going to be constantly this argument of, oh, it's political. It's not. It's a human connection, respect, love, nurturing, and embrace.
Someone else has another question here, which is, I mentioned earlier the barriers, right? The difference between my experience and say yours or others' experiences. As a left-hander, I adapted, but no one put up barriers in front of me. Whereas for African Americans and others, deliberate systemic barriers placed in front of you to keep you from advancing, right? That's part of the system. Someone has a question is, do you think there are more barriers being put up today, or are there barriers being torn down relative to this question of systemic racism?
That's
especially in the education system, the K through 12 education system.
That's such a good question. I applaud that question, because I feel like it goes both ways. We're not sure. And I think this COVID era will definitely give us a chance to study this some more, to see what comes out of this in the next 4 or 5 years. We see where, people are definitely aware. People who want to be aware are aware. So like the questioner there, the person who wrote the question is questioning, and that's a good thing. That's an A+ from my end, and wanting to know more. So there are barriers, and they're being worked on structurally. We see that St. Joseph's College of Maine, Villanova, 2 colleges that I'm personally affiliated with, and I see that we're trying to decolonize the curriculum. We're trying to bring in more professors and teachers that sort of look like me, or may sound like me, and give students a chance to see that it, because just imagine a 4-year-old who's never seen an African American pediatrician or a surgeon or that. They may grow up thinking all doctors are white, or if they've never seen an African American captain in the army, they may think all everybody in the army or in the military per se are white. So, we're giving people a different chance to see from different lens, and we're certainly seeing that in the education system with the books that are being chosen, the books that are being read in the curriculum. In Cherry Hill, for instance, they just included African American studies, so the students as a mandatory course for all students. So students hopefully will see and learn and question, and hopefully the teachers will be equipped enough to like dig deeper with those questions that will surface in those classes, and not just see African Americans as a marginalized group, because they're not, but to see them as a liberated group, and that will help the students that are learning to also see themselves as liberated people, because as a Jamaican, I got to quote Bob Marley, who says, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. How can you emancipate yourself from mental slavery when you're constantly being demonized, when you're constantly being treated as somebody that's barbaric, and you're marginalized and you're ostracized by society? How can you free yourself? Like, I can free myself because I know I was trained. I knew that once I came to America, I could be whatever I wanted to be. Like, there was no question asked. I knew I was set up for success. I knew that the path, I knew the path wouldn't be smooth. Obviously, there would be obstacles and barriers and all that, but I knew I could work through them. You talk to an African American kid, which I do. I do hang out with the kids in my neighborhood, the younger kids, because I try to get in their minds a little bit. And they'll say, "No, I can't go to college. What are you talking?" They call me the Green Machine. What are you talking about, the Miss Green Machine? We can't go. I said, what are you talking about? There's two guys, Guy and Percy. That's their names. I said, you're going to be a lawyer. You're going to be an educator. Like, I speak that into life so they understand, and they begin to understand that there are no barriers that can prevent them. And I think that's where it's ought to be. Like, if you constantly tell people they're nothing, they'll be nothing. They'll feel like they're nothing. I think that's systemic racism. If people are constantly being told you're of no importance, no value to society. And we do it in very, very subtle ways, right? You don't necessarily say that, but we do it in very interesting ways. Like the woman who tried to silence me, God bless her. But, you silence people, you rob them of their dignity, you take their worth, you take their value, you take everything that they have. And this is just my one example of where I felt that way. Can you imagine if for your entire 40, 50, 60 years of your life, these are the examples where you've been called minority. I hate that word, by the way. And you've been treated differently, and you've been set aside by society. Your mind and your spirit becomes dampened. And I guess that's why I like my course, Black Catholic History, because I think, students should study that. Students should understand, students should relate, and, maybe visit an African American church one day and see why is it African Americans worship so differently? Why is it they feel that spirit when they sing? Because you have to. When your mind is being robbed and everything is being, collapsed around you, like the only thing you have is you and your God. And even, you know that you have that dignity with God, and at some point in life, God will take care of you. If not now, at some point in life, maybe in the afterlife, God will repay you for who you are spiritually. So I guess that's where I become passionate, because I really want people to see that we're all spiritual beings connected.
So we're going to finish our conversation with this last question that came in, and it connects again to education experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also, our common sharing in the kind of the mercy heritage, right? The heritage
Mm-hmm.
of Sisters of Mercy. And the question is, how can we help change systemic racism on primarily white campuses? And
Perfect.
what might that look like through a mercy lens?
Perfect question. I love that question so much, because that's what I try to incorporate in my curriculum, in my building, in my programs. First thing, how do we incorporate that? It's really conversations like this. I want to thank you for this opportunity, because this is so much healing for me. I'm sharing with you some of my deepest thoughts and my experiences, and I see this as a kind of reconciliation, like a kind of healing. Provide opportunities like this for people, for African American students or Latino students or people of color, to sit with mainly white groups. So have circles and communities connect and talk about what some of those differences are. We've been doing this program called Living Room Conversations, and it's an education program. Just look it up online, Living Room Conversations, and students are having the chance to talk to people with different people from the suburbs, people from the urban areas, to talk about what their experiences are like. So Find people. Brian Stevenson is my guide in this. Find people that are different from you. I love that your wife is Mexican, by the way. I sort of clapped in my heart because like that's beautiful. That's two beautiful connections of cultures coming together. Find friendship networks that are different from yours that you're primarily used to spending time with. If you're used to an Italian group or an Irish American group where you all meet together every week, find ways to include other people to your circles. Find ways in school to do so. And if your school is primarily white, which I know that happens to their schools that are primarily Black, I've seen that too. Living room conversations or reading about stories, getting acquainted with, getting proximate, learning stories. You may not be able to meet my two friends, Guy and Percy, in your neighborhood because of where you are geographically, but maybe someday you'll have a service experience. I remember inviting St. Joe's down to Camden when I worked at the Romero Center, and they came, thanks to Deacon Frank Daggett. They came. I just simply made a phone call. I might have emailed him, and as a student at St. Joe's at that time, and they came. They came down with 10 students. 3 of those students I'm still in touch with now today. Like it's incredible, and they're in Maine. They're in that area of Standish and Portland, those areas. So find situations where you can. I did a year of service with 5 girls from Minnesota and different parts of the country that have never seen Brooklyn, that have never worked with that population of diversity. 2 other girls stayed in Brooklyn. They never went back home. So finding opportunities. Mercy Volunteer Corps. Education, reading Just Mercy is a great example. Earlier today, I just typed in systemic racism in Amazon, and you should have seen the books that came out, that came up, really popular books. My book, obviously, Awakening, will be out soon with my co-author, Vince Gallagher, hopefully soon. We're still in the beginning phases of things. But, reading, try to question, understand, relate, find people of color, email a professor, find me, email me. I'd be glad to answer your question. I may not have all the answers, but I may know a few people that may have some answers for you based on their experience. Don't rob people of their dignity. Find out why a certain person is behaving. You see a certain name come into your store or your job. Don't just like put that application to the bottom of your application. So yeah, those are just some ideas that come to the top of my head. I'd be glad to send you a list as well of things that I've copied and pasted here in my cell phone over time.
And what I'm going to do too is this video is being recorded, and we're going to put it on our YouTube channel as well. And
Awesome.
I'll put a title slide with your email, so that
Great.
our students would like to get in touch with you about how they can kind of further ask questions or kind of further their steps on this journey. They can get in touch with you and communicate with you. So,
Absolutely.
Sherine,
Thank you.
Thank you for being part of this conversation. Thank you for your commitment to mercy, both through your volunteer work and through your teaching and through your ministry as well, with your church and the work that you do. It was a pleasure to talk with you, and I wish you all the best in all your work.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Chris. I feel like I know you so much better out of this very much healing conversation. I want to thank you and the team at St. Joe's. I feel like I'm there in Maine. I'm not. In my mind, I'm there. But I want to thank you for all that you do, and God's richest blessings to you.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you very much. Be well.